Hello and welcome to The Drum Show, the show that aims to prove that marketing really can change the world. I'm senior reporter for tech at the Drum, Chris Sutcliffe. This week, we're going to be talking about Ogilvy's striking decision not to work with influencers that adjust their image too much, Twitter's changes in the wake of Elon Musk joining and then not joining and then potentially joining the board again, and beyond that, what the potential ramifications are for the sale of Channel 4. I'm joined by two absolute experts to talk about this. So I've got Jenny Quigley-Jones with me, who is CEO of Digital Voices, and Gordon Young, who is editor-in-chief at The Drum. So to begin with, we're going to be talking about Ogilvy. And just to kind of cue things up, I spoke to one of our reporters, Hannah Bowler, about exactly this. And I think we've got a clip of that right now.
Last week, Ogilvy came out and said that it would be banning or stop working with influencers that distort or edit their bodies and faces, to start working towards stripping that back and only working with influencers that kind of contrast is allowed, changing of brightness is allowed, but basically it's a no if you're going to be touching up or editing.
And what were some of the reasons they gave for trying to implement that?
So the main reason was essentially to kind of end a lot of the systemic problems that social media influencers can put on people that are having a hard time with their body image. Also, they are kind of hoping with this that gradually they'll start working with kind of more authentic influencers, and it will strip back some of those kind of more edited people in the first place.
Why have they gone to the influencer side for this? Why isn't this something that is being put on the brands, I suppose?
Ogilvy's argument is that influencer marketing is supposed to be the authentic side of marketing. And that is where it runs into a problem of them being edited the same way as a magazine model will be edited or a billboard would be edited. So I think it's trying to strip that back to the kind of initial point of influencer marketing, which is supposed to be ordinary people doing ordinary things.
What has been the response to this? Have people accused Ogilvy of doing this as a bit of a stunt, or do people see this as a step in the right direction?
It's definitely a bit of both. I mean, a lot of people have called out Ogilvy for that kind of brand purpose washing, I guess. The other kind of feedback has kind of been on a logistics front. You know, how will this be done in practice? That's an argument. And then another kind of key one is this whole idea of maybe demonizing or penalizing influencers. Those are the kind of core challenges, I think, to this policy.
Do we expect that this is going to be, that we're going to see people following suit, or is this almost Ogilvy alone standing, drawing the line in the sand and saying, actually, we're going to be doing this regardless of what everybody else does?
I think that this might have set off a bit of a chain reaction within the industry. And I think a lot of people will move to do something similar. I have my reservations if it will go as far as the not working with influencers. A lot of agencies and a lot of people I've spoken to are kind of more on the board of maybe having a disclose button. But I think definitely that things are going to change, I think, from this.
So Hannah's queued up so much that we could talk about there. From this fact that, you know, we have been grappling with this to some extent for years and years, just in different forms, to the idea that it almost penalizes some of the influencers. But to begin with, Jenny, what was sort of your knee-jerk reaction when you heard the news?
Yeah, I think so. There's a little bit of misunderstanding in that it is not that they will not ever work with influencers who retouch their faces or bodies. It's the content in advertising campaigns cannot be retouched. So they'll still work with those creators who have edited themselves in the past, partly because you can't stop doing that as an agency. Brands are really excited about it. Agencies are really excited about it. A lot of influencers are really excited about it. And I think it's a positive moral step in the industry to be discussing it. However...
Okay, I knew there was a however coming.
I've got two howevers with it, because I do think it is a step in the right direction. Firstly, why just influencer marketing? Again, it's like ad declaration needs to be so much harsher with influencer marketing. When someone goes on a press trip for PR, do they declare that they've got a free holiday? No. And they should do. Yeah. Like when a little P comes up in Coronation Street, I don't know what that means. Like I've never known what that means. So why are we holding influencers to a higher standard than anyone else? Like I'm glad Ogilvy's doing it as part of WPP, because WPP should be refusing to body retouch or facially alter all of their advertising.
Wow.
That's what they should be doing. If they really, really believed in this as a stance, that is where they should be taking it. And they're not. They're still producing billboards and adverts that are edited and idealised. They're creating the problem and then blaming influencers for it.
And we spoke we spoke briefly before the panel about the idea that this actually does create disincentives for some influencers to potentially work with these brands, because their whole image, you know, in as much as influencer marketing is based on authenticity, the visual language does kind of reinforce this idea that you need to be slightly touched up if you want to gain an audience to begin with. So is there a disincentive there?
I think a lot of influencers will be excited to be more authentic or to say, oh, a brand has forced me to be more authentic. I think the issue is with like CGI influencers and entirely artificial, like virtual influencers, they're always idealized. But actual influencers, if they're saying, oh, Dove or Magnum ice cream that we work with is like forcing me to use beautifying filters, I think they'd be happy with that because they get to be themselves and have that more honest conversation with audiences.
So that it's still, that sop to authenticity as well, and it just happens to align with what the brand wants as well. So Gordon, we actually have our own virtual influencer at the Drum, Floresta Nass, who I haven't seen for a while actually. Is this because we're more concerned about how we're presenting the image of beauty across the industry, or do you think that Ogilvy is maybe doing this as a bit of a stunt?
Well, they are probably doing it as a bit of a stunt, but in saying that, they've definitely hit a sort of seam of real interest. I think this has been the biggest story on the Drum for quite a few months, so it's generating a huge amount of interest. But I do take your point, why are we saying influencers? I think Ogilvy justified that because they're meant to be authentic. But this whole issue is an old issue. I remember when Marks and Spencer's, first started advertising. Remember, Marks and Spencer's for a long time didn't believe in doing any advertising. That was their big positioning statement. And when they finally conceded, they had to do some advertising. One of the first commercials was a normal person. So we're not going to use models. We're going to use a normal person. Was it a normal person? I think memory serves me correctly. It was a naked normal person.
Okay, all
so
right.
Running through the countryside, going up and down hills, saying, I'm normal. And I think the whole market was saying, for God's sake, I wish the filter had been invented for that. because people don't really want to buy normal. What they want to do is buy a dream. And a lot of what we do in marketing is we sell this sort of aspirational stuff. It's not about selling the warts. It's about selling the sort of this dream, which most people appreciate is maybe not attainable, but nevertheless, it's something to aspire towards.
It goes back to the point of like, is marketing changing the world? Could you change the aspirations of people? So fair enough, for a while, people aren't buying more as a result of these untouched ads or more diverse ads, which is shocking. But that's because we've been so programmed. So maybe in that sense, Ogilvy start having the conversation is powerful, right? We need to reset our expectations with marketing. We need to reset what we're looking for.
Yeah, it's definitely getting the balance.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of different levels to this. I think with Dove have been doing great work in this area. Obviously, that sort of reverse selfie campaign, but, because you do not want the filters and the deepfake AI turning in, say, a 12-year-old into a 22-year-old.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of there's a dark side to this as well. So there's all sorts of different levels to it. But the other thing, I think the aspirational side is important. So I don't think you can ever sort of have a blanket policy that we're never going to retouch another model's face.
So I suppose the question then is, in as much as there are levels about kind of what level of aspiration we can, present in advertising, are there levels in terms of how we think that the industry will take what Ogilvy's doing and run with it? Hannah brought up the fact that there might be some disclosure forms that people might have to include to say, actually, this model has been touched up. You were talking about some of the kind of the tech aspects of making this possible before and how difficult it actually is to do. Yeah. So do we think we're going to find a happy middle point between what Ogilvy is trying to say and what we can actually do practically as an industry?
Yeah, so I think Raoul is a great guy, and we were discussing it when he was first kind of coming up with this idea. They've gone along the lines of, we've got a tool called Influence O, and Influencer O will use AI to compare the branded content we're sent to influencers' previous content to work out if they've been retouching it or not. And I don't think that's how the industry works. Obviously, that's one, an Ogilvy only tool. And two, I don't know if the AI is there yet, if I'm honest. I think what it'll be more an instance of is brands and agencies asking, hey, can you send us the raw files for this? And then you compare it. And so before you approve the content, you compare it to the raw files. Because this idea of AI spotting their previous, what if they've always retouched their faces as well? How will it know what's real?
Yeah, I'd be really annoyed if you hadn't done a retouch and you were called out for it.
Yeah, I'd be
you just had a nose job or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think technologically it's really hard to do. And if this is going to become an industry-wide stance, you're going to have to find a more accessible way of agencies and brands policing content.
Yeah, and just getting a balance, because people have always, I feel like, wanted to project a different image to the world.
Yep.
They've done it before. Digital technology, wore makeup, or they did resort to plastic surgery, or all sorts of different things.
Well, even before that, Anne Boleyn sent Henry VIII a painting that looked nothing like her to get him to marry her. So obviously this has been going on for centuries.
If only AI existed then.
Well, Tudor AI would have made the world a very, very different place. But yeah, just as a kind of final point on this then, do we think that this is something that we're going to see more people sign up to, or is this a kind of one and done thing that we think will, somebody will emulate again in a couple of years?
I think more people will sign up to it. I think more brands will talk about it. My fear with it is that brands are going to start using it as an excuse to police influencers' bodies. So we already have brands who come to us who say, by the way, we don't want to work with anyone who's had surgery. And we're like, one, how do you know?
Yeah.
Like, if they're private about it, how do you know? Two, if they've shared their surgery journey and talked about why and their emotional distress and built that relationship with their audience and shared like recovery, isn't that better? Like,
it's more authentic.
It's more authentic. So I think my fear with it is that I want this to happen. I want the images that come out to be more realistic and relatable. That is a given. We want more brands to do that. But this entitlement over people's bodies and the everyday influencers who are supposed to be normal, accessible people, and having brands say, actually, I don't like the way their face looks, or I think they've had a boob job, is not where I want to go with this. Like, that's my big fear. I think it's a good thing, but just has to be handled in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the first step along a process. It's not necessarily the end in and of itself.
And it's brilliant. What's brilliant is we were having a conversation, and I think the conversation was a valuable part of it. I tend to get very cynical about then putting buttons on to control it and regulation, but the main thing is the market's educated enough to actually work out what's going on themselves, and that's I think half the battle.
The other thing about this influencers being ordinary people, I think misunderstands the industry. Influencer marketing isn't just about authenticity. Influencer marketing is about the democratization and control of media. It's about people choosing to represent however they want to. You look at digital fashion, are they going to say people can't wear digital fashion in images? Like, it's not fundamentally about looking like everyone. It's about expressing creativity and owning media and owning the rights to make money from that. So I think we need to leave space for artistic integrity as well. So make sure it's not a slippery slope that goes down that.
Well, absolutely. Actually, moving on then, talking about people who may or may not be ordinary, Elon Musk has decided that he is going to step down from the Twitter board that he never really joined, potentially with an eye on acquiring more of Twitter. So just a brief potted history about what happened here. So a couple of weeks ago, Elon Musk acquired just under 10% of Twitter. He's been a frequent critic of the social platform. He's been saying it's not good for free speech and that a lot of its actions that he have taken, so for instance, banning Donald Trump, fly in the face of freedom of expression and what people should be doing on social media. So he acquired 10% of Twitter. He implemented a raft of changes kind of through pressure alone, asking if people wanted an edit button, all this kind of stuff. And then the CEO of Twitter asked if he would join the board. He said yes. And then as of, I think, 2 days ago, after the time of recording, he actually said no. And the implication seems to be that he wants to acquire much more of Twitter than he actually has. So my question to both of you before we actually begin the discussion is, to what extent do you think this is overblown? Because Twitter actually delivers very little in terms of direct traffic. It's more of a newswire for a lot of people. Do we necessarily place more importance on Twitter than it deserves because we work in marketing and media?
I'd say yes, probably do. I think it's definitely used by people in marketing media, and they probably believe the greater universe uses it. Yep. It's a relatively small social media platform. Before Elon Musk was investing in it, it did look a bit, rudderless to a certain extent. It's not growing as fast as its competitors, and I think the whole Elon Musk thing has given it a new lease of life. It's just a great story. I mean, I love that story.
Well, you only have to look at its share price to see that it has galvanized people to invest and look at what Twitter could be rather than what it is. One of the things that came out over the past couple of weeks is the NYT's CEO, Dean Baquet, said, actually, no, as you mentioned, people who are on Twitter think about it as being representative of the public, where it's not necessarily. But to the extent that it is influential, Donald Trump used it as his primary comms platform. His new social media platform, Truth Social, emulates it to some extent. When we talk about Twitter, what are we talking about? Comms platform?
And if it's a news source that people use, we can't understate the power of it, because the opinions on Twitter do filter down. And yeah, do we want billionaires? I mean, what if Trump had bought the share of Twitter? Would we be discussing it in such a positive way? Like, and also, why during COVID have we let, okay, I'm going to get political.
No, go, yeah.
Why have we let billionaires get away with the Gini coefficient and inequality increasing and act like that's okay? That's the other thing. Like, do we want these spaces for public discourse to be owned by controversial billionaire figures?
Yeah, billionaires have always bought trophy assets. Like, so maybe a century ago, everyone would want to buy a newspaper, but now it's a social media platform.
Yeah,
and I think that's a part of the motivation. It's this trophy asset, gives them some influence. The interesting thing about platforms like Twitter is the fact that they're not edited platforms. Gives them a lot of protection because they're not then legally responsible for what people say in the platform. So the Drum had this issue. We used to publish comments under stories.
Yeah.
As long as we didn't actually edit the stories, we skipped a lot of liability. And in the US, they seem to be crossing the line where they're moving much more into an edited environment. And there might be an opportunity for some Elon Musk to actually take Twitter back out of that and say, actually, we're going to make it much more open. The downside is you're going to get views you might not necessarily agree with. But nevertheless, to protect it as a sort of town, I think it's called a town hall, we're going to maybe make it much more of an open platform again.
Well, so much of what you said there kind of speaks to a lot of the reaction I saw, which is that, as you mentioned, kind of whereas Jeff Bezos he's bought newspapers up, and we've seen that in the past as well, that Twitter actually lets you exert a lot of soft power. It's cultural power rather than kind of financial power as well. So the question that got asked a lot, and it's been one of the most key points of contention under our stories about this, is whether Elon Musk's preoccupation with free speech is actually going to make it a less safe space for brands and users. So obviously he's talking about free speech in terms that people should be allowed to say whatever they want, but that does fly in the face of what Twitter's been doing in terms of making it a sort of a much more comfortable space for people who don't necessarily feel free to express themselves in real life. So do we think there is potentially a clash here between what Twitter wants to do in terms of being a safe space and what Musk thinks of being the biggest priority?
I mean, do you remember the Chilean miners? It was the Thai. He was accused of bullying the person. He was accused of bullying on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's hard to police when he owns 10% of the company, which is why I think it's a good thing if he's not on the board, because he's at least trying to limit his influence over policy.
Yeah. He's quite litigious as well. Elon Musk is quite.
I'm almost worried about this discussion.
We love him though. We love him.
Love Elon. Love Elon, but
Well, one of the other things that came up was this idea that Twitter has made a lot of investments in making sure that it's a good space for advertising. So partnerships with sporting.
But that's his one of his concerns. He's saying the advertisers are beginning to dictate policy. So this sort of need to be brand safe means that they're cancelling a lot of opinions because the brands don't like it. So I think what Elon's saying, because obviously when first
Elon, I was going to say.
L to those who know him.
Calling from your Tesla on the way out.
Right, or Mr. Musk, is basically that maybe they should move to other sort of revenue models, like a subscription model, for example. He
was talking about that ad-free model and subscriptions, and that does track with what they've done with, for instance, the acquisition of Review, which is a newsletter platform which lets you subscribe. His big push is for people to be able to tip directly using cryptocurrencies like Dogecoin. Does that make it necessarily?
It's like Silicon Valley speaking to Silicon Valley, isn't it? Like, it's like, oh wow, there's a white male, very privileged billionaire who's now saying who should feel safe and who shouldn't on a social platform.
Yeah.
Like, what's his experience of diversity or any struggle or discrimination? Like, why should he be dictating a policy that defines a safe space?
Yeah, but the problem is, although we can sort of look at one individual thing, is these organisations are already dictating that policy, and I do think it's a danger that because even with sort of the new I can't remember called the new Data Act in the UK. The unintended consequence of that is that the censorship will become a lot heavier because they don't want to expose themselves to fines in the UK jurisdiction. So I think that sort of the freedom of speech was under attack, and some of the opinions expressed, although like cynicism about the coronavirus, a lot of these sort of things which were suppressed are now becoming quite legitimate points of view. The best thing is maybe Biden's laptop, isn't it? Joe Biden's laptop.
That took off. That should have been, as Twitter has done over the past couple of months, particularly around coronavirus and particularly around after the January 6 riots, they have labelled things a lot better. They have said, oh, this is state-affiliated media. That's not censorship. It's just information.
Yeah.
And they've also said, actually, this flies in the face of what the World Health Organization has said as well.
Yeah, and
Do you think they should have banned Trump?
I think at the time, probably yes, because it was mid-insurrection. I'm not saying that it should have been a full-on ban because it was his mouth. Like there are legitimate questions to be raised about whether taking away somebody's primary means of communication with an audience is censorship or whether that is just good when they are actually actively causing harm. But at the same time, Twitter is a private organization. It has the right to make those decisions. And if the public doesn't like it, they have the right to go elsewhere.
Yeah.
Don't know why my
to
voice
another
broke.
platform owned by another billionaire, which they can do.
Well, exactly, yeah.
And
But for him to universally banned, I'm in two minds about it. I can see the sort of arguments on both sides, but actually for a sort of, I think he was still a serving president when he was actually banned. And there's obviously lots of other serving leaders around the world who weren't banned, who were equally in favour. It just seems it was a quite a dangerous step.
yeah, it's part of Twitter's evolution, right? Like, Twitter used to be the place where they wouldn't even stop pornography. Like, so if you looked at, so if you travelled for a conference, and then after you left the conference, the days afterwards, check the hashtag of that conference, it would not be highlights from the conference. It would be prostitutes trying to find visiting punters. And Twitter weren't banning, like, any pornographic content, and that was their stance. And I think as the platform matured and faced more government pressure and had to think more about inclusion and safe spaces, that's where they matured to. And the debate is, do you take the platform back, or is that where the established platform should go, to this kind of more guarded place? And then there's still space for, like, new platforms that can have those big debates, that can have the Trump debates. But part of being a grown-up social media platform is policing. And being responsible for the content on there.
The policing and regulation increases, the opportunities for small disruptors to actually get profile is then reduced. Just one of those things, isn't it? I mean, this is why I've loved the digital revolution. Because 20 years ago, there was the gatekeepers were so strong in terms of whoever owned a printing press could run a newspaper, whoever ran a TV license ran a TV license fee. So you couldn't get information out there. But because of this digital revolution, organisations like the Drum have been able to grow into the third largest platform of its type in the world. But that wouldn't have been possible under these old regimes. And I just sort of suppose, as an entrepreneur, worry about this regulations is going to creep back in, and what is going to be done with it is going to prevent disruptors coming to the market. So the people who are there already are going to protect the incumbents, are going to protect the position.
Well, before you mentioned kind of the unintended consequences of the online harms bill, and speaking of kind of government taking steps and interfering in media and making changes to kind of a media landscape, our next story is about Channel 4, because obviously Nadine Dorries, who's Culture Secretary, has suggested, or rather said that she's going to go ahead with the government plans to privatise Channel 4 after nearly 40 years of being a publicly owned company. So we have an interview with our reporter Hannah Bowler, whose primary focus is on television, and she's going to take us through everything that's been happening about this over the past couple of weeks.
What's been happening over the past couple of weeks in terms of the privatisation of Channel 4?
Nadine Dorries, as ever, made a kind of shock announcement that Channel 4 would be sold off after the consultation period. So since then, it's just really been a kind of whirlwind kind of week or so, kind of on the back foot of that.
And so what are some of Nadine Dorries' arguments for this? Because I thought this had been comprehensively put to bed from a commercial standpoint a couple of months ago when there was a huge pushback from the marketing and media world.
Nadine's kind of main argument that she claims is the fact that in order to compete with Netflix and Disney, basically Channel 4 needs to have more cash in order to inject into content and be a genuine kind of global player to compete with them. And then there's a second one from the government that they need apparently £1 billion worth of money back into the Treasury. So they're her kind of two core principles.
But we've seen another strong pushback. You mentioned kind of the chief executive of Channel 4 there as well. But what's been the rest of the industry's response?
Yeah, so from the advertiser perspective, a lot of the agencies, a lot of the media buyers and all the trade bodies actually have come out again expressing their concern over a privatised Channel 4. They're worried about increased competition. So there's kind of a fear that this will kind of cannibalise on the ad competition in the UK.
And what about from I suppose, a cultural standpoint? Because I saw there was a huge emotive response to this as well.
This whole time, a lot of people have pulled out individual shows to kind of show, well, Netflix would have never have made this, Amazon would have never made this. And I think Channel 4's remit is to basically make kind of edgy young skewing programming, which is built into its kind of core beliefs and how it commissions. So there is a complete concern that when something's made for profit, it will not commission those shows. I think everyone kind of always uses It's a Sin as the example, which, you know, arguably might not have been paid for by Netflix or Amazon.
So what can we expect in terms of the ongoing conversation?
I think what we can probably expect is a little bit more kind of teaser information about potential bids. So I think over the next few kind of weeks and months, we'll start to get a bit of a feel for who might be going for this, what the kind of terms will be. Those types of conversations might eke through into the press, I think.
Who do you think are some of the front runners in terms of who might take it?
Oh, it's quite an interesting one, I think. I mean, Discovery was touted as the kind of buyer back in 2016 when this was also discussed. But I think now there's a bit of a challenge around the Warner merger, Discovery merger, which might kind of put this on the back foot for them. I mean, Paramount is also a solid bet. I mean, they took up Channel 5 and have really revamped that. So I think Paramount might be an interesting option. Sky kind of sits a bit separately in my eyes, but it's still, you know, would weigh it up, I think.
So that's not a conversation that's going away anytime soon. In fact, this is something that has been rumbling on for years, the conversation around privatization of Channel 4. Last year, we saw big pushback from ISBA, from all the advertising groups in the UK, effectively saying this will hamstring the ability of kind of the wider British creative sector to deliver upon its promise to, you know, create programs that actually excite and delight. So, Gordon, I think when we were talking about this before, you think that potentially there is an argument to be made that privatization would be good for the wider media industry.
Interesting question. It's not. I've always found it surprising that an organisation like Channel 4 is publicly owned in the first place, and the people I've been speaking to about it, most people didn't seem aware it was actually owned by the state. So I can understand the issues. The ad industry are concerned that they don't want a monopoly growing, which will maybe push up the prices. I can understand the concerns that the production industry wants to grow and wants to be supported. But what I'm never really interested is why the solution to that is for the state to own a terrestrial broadcaster. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, why wouldn't the state suddenly own, you know, I don't know, buying supermarkets to sort of say, actually, we want to make sure there's, you know, local food supported and consumers of good quality, you know. Why do we start buying? Why do we start buying pubs to make sure there's a difference and divergence in sort of public house offer? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And if you look at all the sort of the assets owned by the government, Channel 4 does seem a bit of an odd fit. So I think sell it, take the £1 billion, and let the, you know, and also the industry's moved on a lot since 1982 when Channel 4 was set up. So back then it was 3 channels. It was very much terrestrial. That was the only option in town. So you can understand why, you know, there was more control maybe required at that point. But nowadays, I think independent production sector is growing anyway. I think there's lots of outlets for diverse content. I mean, Amazon. I mean, you know, I'm not sure I should admit this or not, but even if you're interested in Morris Minor cars, I can find a show on Amazon that will sort of indulge my interest in Morris Minors.
Okay. Yeah, you've told on yourself there a little bit, I think.
Yeah. But that, but yeah, walks in the room, I have to change channel very quickly.
So, you know, as Gordon mentioned there, the broadcasting industry, the broadcasting sector has moved on, not just with the advent of, you know, Sky and some of the kind of the cable channels, but also now with VOD and streaming services as well. To what extent do you think that Channel 4 fits in well among that kind of the wider landscape?
So Channel 4 don't own production. They don't have their own production teams.
They are forbidden from doing it. It has to be farmed out to independent production companies.
And it is so hard now. It's fascinating. Lots of our clients, we work with a lot of different clients in that space. They can't get production companies because Disney, Netflix, Amazon have bought them all up for the next few months because there's such a demand for content. So I just think Channel 4, maybe you're right, privatising might take them into this era that we're in now, where it is about competing to produce content and winning eyeballs and winning loyalty. I think that's far more exciting.
Yeah. Another thing is, at the moment, it's commercially still doing okay because there's still demand for sort of terrestrial advertising, but 5-6 years from now, I think that will start to decline. I mean, I spoke to my kids. They barely know what Channel 4 even is. If you look at what ITV are planning now, ITV are planning to totally move away from the sort of the terrestrial TV, look a lot more about developing subscription models, investing a lot more in production. So even ITV do not see a future in the sort of terrestrial TV. So I think the argument is sell it now why you can still get £1 billion, because if you wait another 5-6 years, it's probably not going to be worth even as much as that.
So the counter argument to that is that a lot of the streaming services like Netflix are so heavily in debt and they do not turn a profit even now. In a section of the interview that we didn't get to see, Hannah was talking about the age of kind of the premium streaming service, the premium production for those kind of VOD services, potentially being a bubble that's about to burst. As we see, so many people are, so many new people are entering the space, there's increased competition. So it does kind of favor those long-established brands. Do we think then that Channel 4, just by dint of being, of having this great heritage of creative programming, stands a better chance than some of the digital upstarts who have come after them? Or is it, dog eat dog?
I still don't understand that the argument in that context why the state would intervene and buy a business or own a business. I think that the market is evolving and the streaming market is going to change, and but ultimately it's not going to go away. We are living through this golden era of content at the moment. I think even if that sort of the gold gets a bit tarnished, it will still be infinitely better than it was when we only had 3 TV channels. So I don't really understand the argument why the state should own one of the channels. And it also opens it up to political interference. So there's always going to be the suspicion that there's somebody trying to control the agenda, or it's favouring maybe left or right. I mean, that's one of the allegations, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Some of the allegations were that this is almost an act of revenge from the government, because obviously Nadine Dorries famously didn't understand how it was funded only a couple of months ago. And so the implication seems to be that by deplatforming Boris Johnson and putting an ice sculpture instead in a political debate, this is now an act of political revenge against Channel 4. I mean, that was a fantastic piece of television in and of itself.
I think it's human nature, though, because if you're Prime Minister and the state-owned broadcaster was taking the mick out of you by putting a block of ice because you didn't have... You'd be so, well, fair play. I'm going to sell you your sods.
But you would have thought that, you would hope that the man...
You'd hope you'd rise above it.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's one of those things, you think, actually, maybe it's not a good fit then with the public sector. So it should obviously be free to do that. But just as a newspaper wouldn't, the Times wouldn't sort of take Murdoch to task every week. It's obvious to me that you're not going to slag off your proprietor without consequences.
But surely that is the benefit of it being a state-owned organisation, is that they have a remit to be independent, and they should be doing this. There's almost we were talking there
what happens if another, because the suggestion is the news is left-leaning. But then what happens is there's a left-leaning government in place. Would the allegation in that they're artificially sort of inflating the share of the vote of that left-leaning government?
I absolutely take that point, but surely the idea is that you put more attention on whoever is in power. I can't see necessarily that Channel 4, even though they do have a history of catering to younger audiences, would necessarily recuse themselves from any responsibility to hold any government to account. That's a hypothetical, and it's not necessarily something that I suppose needs to factor into this debate.
Yes, but it's a difficult debate. What is confusing is the fact the government own it.
Yeah.
Of course, they should be free to be. They should have editorial independence. But there's always going to be a sort of suspicion with that editorial independence if it's state-owned. It's just one of those things. So maybe, find another ownership model for it, and then that resolves that.
Like you said, there's already so much. So we work with the BBC quite a lot, and there's already so much confusion with young people as to the TV license fee and what that is and how it works and where it goes. But so that in itself is a debate. But if it's state-owned, why don't Channel 4 get some of the license fee?
Well,
I know it's a structure,
there's an interesting suggestion that what was going to happen here is that the government are going to put the Channel 4 up for sale, and then they're going to arrange for the commercial division of the BBC to buy it. So the BBC can then benefit from the sales and the commercial stuff coming through, which then allow them to reduce the license fee. That's an interesting idea.
Interesting. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things as well that we are talking purely in hypotheticals here. We don't know who will buy it. We don't know what the new ownership structure will be like. We don't know whether Channel 4, whoever buys it, will continue to have that remit to use independent production companies, or even if they will commit to funding some shows that would never have been funded elsewhere. But we're talking about Film 4. We're talking about so many of the shows that have shaped the cultural landscape as well. I think there's potentially a danger there that, as Hannah mentioned, that the commercial imperatives will limit, you're talking about private companies potentially limiting free speech, and in terms of how they actually, treat stuff. A private company doesn't necessarily have to fund interesting and innovative programs in the same way that Channel 4 currently does.
But when you talk about like the space, the crowded space, right, of streaming services, there is so much demand for niche content. So, and monetizing niche content is far more likely to happen than monetizing like general, not great shows that someone's commissioning because they're worried that like if they don't sign it off, someone else will sign it off. So maybe there's a space for Channel 4 to kind of double down on the more innovative, young-facing kind of type of content they produce, and that at least gives them a USP in amongst the other streaming services.
Yeah, potentially, and I think that's what Film 4 has done as well. They've won, Academy Awards, they've won BAFTAs, they've won all sorts, and it's in part because they have committed to funding that kind of stuff. So I think this obviously good. You were talking about Ogilvy being the biggest story over the past couple of months, but this is going to rumble on and on and on, isn't it? This isn't going to go away anytime soon.
No, well, it's never had. I mean, it's always rumbled on for 40 years. I mean, even in Margaret Thatcher's sort of memoirs, she was talking about the argument for selling off Channel 4. She was.
She set it up.
She set it up.
Like 4 years later.
She set it up, but within her, by the time she retired, by the time she came to write her book anyway, she was saying actually they're looking at selling it. So it's always been an active discussion. I think the reason they haven't done it is because it's the hassle and the controversy. It's probably not worth the fight.
Well, you mentioned that it is a fight, and so to round off this episode of the Drum Show, we're going to show you some of the most emotive responses that we've seen across social media, and there have been more than a few. But for now, thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much, Gordon, for taking part, and thank you to everybody who's watched at home. Hopefully, this has proved that marketing really can change the world.